I'm Paul Harris. I work at the HC Coombs Policy Forum, and just let me quickly introduce my panel members who you've met previously, I think. Dr. Subho Banerjee, who's from the Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency in the Australian Government. So Assistant Professor Matthew Desmond from Harvard, Professor Bruce Weston from Harvard, and Professor Glenn Loury from Brown University. We're going to ask Subho to kick off, but I guess by way of introduction, I did just want to briefly pay tribute to another colleague from Harvard University, Professor Carol Weiss, who passed away earlier this year. And in my kind of dream panel, it would have been great to have her here at the ANU one time. I think over her long career, she wrote really consistently and eloquently about how research and science and social science is actually used in government. And there's a fantastic quote from her when she was talking about this very issue in the late 70s. And she wrote that the research suggests that it takes an extraordinary concatenation of circumstances for a piece of research to have a direct impact or an influence in policy. And I think the benefit of Carol's work was really that she provided a framework for thinking about this issue more broadly, and she wasn't for a moment suggesting that direct or instrumental impact on policy was the only impact that research had. And I'm confident that with the expertise of our panel members today, we might be able to unpack this big issue of research influence and impact in policy a little bit and dig into some of the complexity. But if I can ask Subho to kick us off, and then we'll talk amongst ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. I wanted to start by saying that I was conscious of an enormous self-selection bias in the audience today, that by definition, by turning up to a forum such as this, you're showing that you're really interested in the interface between research and policy and interested in making it work better. And I think that that does make you a subset of the community that we are talking about here on the academic side and on the public servant side. And of course, I'm also conscious that speaking in front of colleagues from the Kennedy School from Harvard, that's really an exemplar of how to have impact from research into policy. And I think that, again, I'm conscious that some of my remarks will be much more general and perhaps aimed at people who aren't in the room today, as a more typical example, I guess, of how this sort of thing works in practice. And my proposition today, at least on the Australian side, about which from which my professional experience is gained, is that this interface between research and policy really isn't working that well for public policy making, and that even those of us in the room today from the Australian side who've demonstrated by turning up an interest in this could perhaps usefully reflect on our own practice, but certainly also talk to colleagues who are interested and think about how more generally we could look to improve matters. So if I start really from the idea that ideas matter a lot in public policy, I noticed that in some of the write-ups for this session, there was a sense that perhaps you can think about a whole range of different inputs to public policy, of which research might only just be one, might be one of many. That's actually not my view. I think research is fundamental. It does have a privileged position when you think about the formation of public policy. I went back to a quote from Keynes, which I've always been really struck by in this regard. And he said, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than it is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist." And I think that's a really striking quote. I think, firstly, what Keynes, I think, was saying was that ideas are very, very powerful in framing the public debate. That narrative stories that are based on big ideas have an enormous influence in how people think and talk about public policy. And that's certainly been my experience. But I think he's also saying something that's very interesting in that quote. He says, both when they are right and when they are wrong. And that's quite striking. That's the idea that the framing itself is powerful, and it's that way of connecting to people that's very powerful. Now, it's actually my view that I'm not neutral between both when they are right and when they are wrong. I think research helps you distinguish between when they are right and when they are wrong. But it puts you in the right frame of mind for thinking about this sort of issue, that research is not just another input, it's fundamental. It provides the best window into the way the world actually works. And of course, that's really crucial when you're thinking about making good public policy. As I said in my introduction, in my experience, and I am cautious here to say that I'm really just talking about my professional experience, I think we could be doing better in the research policy interface in Australia. I was involved during my time at the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet in thinking about some different modes of working with academia and with the ANU in particular. And I'm really pleased to say that I think the example, the Coombs Policy Forum, is a good innovation, is a good illustration of how you can get much better interaction and conversation between academia and the public service. But I think it is still relatively rare. I'm very happy to hear either from the panel or from the discussion if people disagree with that as the proposition, but I think we could do a lot better. As a generalisation, I think in the Australian debate, academics generally feel underutilised. There's a sense that there's a lot of expertise on offer that isn't being utilised, and public servants feel unsupported. There's a sense that we're actually grappling with a whole bunch of questions that we would really like some further advice on that we're not really getting. So why is it so hard? I think the usual diagnosis of those on the government side is that we're too closed, and too closed on behalf of ministers. That we've already made up our minds about how the question should be asked, or even worse, what the answer should be. Now, of course, I can't speak for every occasion and for every public servant, but I don't think this is actually generally the case. But it is such a widespread perception that I think it is worth talking through and worth discussing with the panel. This sense that things are actually closed. You're asking for advice much too late in the process. You've already made up your mind. You're looking for what's known derisively as policy-based evidence. You've decided on the policy action and you're just looking to flesh it out behind that. I don't think that's the case. Now, in the rest of my remarks, I'll make the point here that, of course, we're talking about a spectrum of different types of problems that we're thinking about, different types of research projects. And I guess broadly speaking, we can characterise that spectrum from relatively narrow, technically based questions where you're looking for a bit of specialist expertise, to much more complex, open-ended questions, what Ian called this morning, the questions where an adaptive approach is required, where you need to think very carefully about the question itself, you need to think about how you're going to go about it, and is very likely to take a degree of iteration to get to any sort of proposed solution. So if we try and explore this idea a little bit further, that what's going on is that in general on the government side we're too closed, I thought it might be worth just thinking a little bit about what exactly do we mean by that? What is that perception? Why are we in that situation? And I thought we'd start by thinking very carefully about the question. Now, as a public servant, I spent a lot of time really thinking very carefully about the question, thinking precisely about the question. And that's actually, I don't think that is the perception. I think that there is a perception that somehow that's already pre-cooked. But in my public service experience, that's not the case. We think very, very hard about the question, and we think a lot about how to get the best possible answer within current constraints, within current information, within the current state of the world for the question that we've been asked. Now, I was going to use a bit of a stylised example today. I think it draws on my experiences in a range of different places, different government posts, but also in working in a think tank for a period of time. But I beg your indulgence, it's not actually a true example. It draws on some of my previous experiences. But the advantage of using a stylised example is that it allows me to be frank without actually breaking any confidences or without actually getting anyone into trouble on either side of the fence. And the example I thought I'd use is the example of thinking about improving teacher quality. And This is something that I dealt with in a previous job. It's not in my current work experience. But if we think about how you approach the question of teacher quality, it's absolutely conceivable that I could be asked the specific question of what's the best thing we could do to try and improve teacher quality. And if I'm asked that question, then let's be absolutely clear about this. I can't go back with, that's really hard, I'm not really sure. I can't go back with, gee, I need a bit more time to think about that. And I can't go back with, now, this other interesting thing I was thinking about. You can't go back with some sense of, well, teacher quality is really hard to get your head around, but I've got a lot of data about class size. Prime Minister, let me tell you about class sizes, because I really can't answer your question about teacher quality. That's not okay. The sense that the best possible answer to the question that you've been asked is an imperative for a public servant when briefing ministers. And I can't emphasise this enough. This is not about my particular situation. I see senior colleagues around the room who've been absolutely in this situation as well. When you are across the table and you are asked that specific question, you have to answer that specific question. Now, when I say that, that's not to say that you can't interrogate the question. It's absolutely reasonable to say, look, why are you interested in teacher quality? To which broadly the answer is, I think that's a very significant driver of student outcomes. And if someone wants to talk to me about, well, actually there are other things you might do that are more important for student outcomes, that's fair game. That's an absolutely reasonable sort of response. But it's not a reasonable response in conversations with the academic side to say, look, there just isn't data about teacher quality, or I just don't have the kind of background to be able to help you, or I've thought about this part of the problem, I can't really answer your part of the problem. That's just, it's almost a category error. It's missing the point of the interaction from my side of the fence. My side of the fence is, I need to answer to the best of my ability, what can you do about teacher quality? And so that precision about the question is incredibly important. Then, of course, we need to think even more carefully about the answer. Now, let's say we have settled on the question, what's the best thing we can do in Australia to try and improve teacher quality? Then, when I think about what the possible answer is, I need to really then think about what the evidence is, think about what the analysis is, and come back and provide the best answer that I can. Now, I mentioned already the term policy-based evidence, and this derision, I guess, this sense that, oh, well, you've already made up your mind when you've come to talk to us. This seems to me more a matter of practice than actually a problem in actuality. Of course, I have a hypothesis about the best way that you might attack teacher quality. That's an entirely reasonable thing to do. My graduate student training was as a physicist. I would have been shot if I didn't have a hypothesis for every problem that I was thinking about. Of course, I start with a hypothesis. Now, the matter of practice, either I'm a good scientist or a good researcher or a good analyst, and I'm prepared to test my hypothesis and think if it's actually true, or I'm poor. I'm not very good at it, and I'm not prepared to actually listen when the evidence says that it moves in a different direction. This is a matter of good versus bad practice. It's not an epistemological matter. It's not a matter of the structure of knowledge itself. There's nothing wrong with having a hypothesis as long as you're prepared to test it against the evidence, as long as you're prepared to look at whether it stands up or not against the evidence. And yet I've heard over and over again this sense that because you might have an ingoing hypothesis, that's somehow invalid. In our teacher quality point, broadly speaking, you might step it out as, look, I'm interested in entry scores, I'm interested in the composition at the front of the pipe, I'm interested in what happens at university, and then I'm interested in what happens when they start work. I'm interested in on-the-job training and what happens at that end. Now, I don't have the specialist expertise to know between those three, which is the most important. I'd be really interested in your views. What do we know? What does literature say? What's your sense of how we might go about this problem? That strikes me again as this is a hypothesis-based iterative method that is absolutely standard practice in the scientific method, and yet when we have policy discussions about this, it's somehow seen as pre-cooking the answer. Now, I understand, I'm not naive to the sense that you might think that there are things that are outside the frame altogether that are more important. And again, in my stylised example, let's say you believe from your specialist expertise that actually the thing we need to do is pay teachers more. Now that seems plausible. Yeah, that might be true. We can have a conversation about why you might think that. But I can also see that there are some things that you need to think about how you can bring it up and in what context, and whether or not these things are actually feasible. And I think this is the bit of the advice, I guess, that I really want to get to in terms of thinking about the research and policy interface. That thinking about institutional context, thinking about history, thinking about how these things are actually put together is crucial in the actual problem definition and whether or not an answer is viable. Now, if the budget constraint is absolute, if I can't pay people more, then that's actually part of how we've set up the problem, and we need to think about what else we can do. Again, that seems to me a legitimate question for a minister to ask, and it's a legitimate question for me as a public servant to try and find the best answer for. In my experience, it's very, very rare that the technical advice or research advice is inconvenient or contrary or somehow not stuff I wanted to hear. It's much more common that it doesn't actually address either the question that I asked in the first place, or it doesn't grapple with historical and institutional context in a way that actually allows it to be meaningful. So again, using our stylised example of teacher training, it's not a sensible response not to think about teacher accreditation through state-based bodies. That's not an assumption you can just, you can assume away. It's not a constraint in the system that somehow, gee, it would be more convenient if we didn't have to worry about that. There's innumerable other aspects of thinking about potential reforms in teacher training that are actually about institutional context. They're about how the universities run. They're about how state bodies accredit teachers, as I said. They're about tenure. They're about career structure. There's a range of these different things. As I say, I'm not going to litigate the substance of the issue. I'm just making the point that a viable answer is one that grapples with the main constraints and really tests them and thinks about which of those constraints is binding and over what sort of time period. That's meaningful and useful advice. That's meaningful and useful research. And of course, the last point in thinking about what useful input might be is a bias to action. It is this sense of, well, you have convinced me, I should do something, what am I going to do? And what am I going to do always involves judgment. It always involves a degree of taking risk. It always involves thinking about, well, on the balance of what I know, you might think about going about it in this way. But it is crucial. Again, if we play that dramatic situation through, you're sitting opposite a minister or the Prime Minister, you've convinced them, and then they say, what am I going to do? You can't say, well, I'll get back to you. You've got to say, well, on the balance of what I know now, on the balance of the research, on the balance of what we've thought about, you can try this. And the risks are that. But it's got to be with a bias to action. And so with that in mind, I guess a bias to action in what we might do about the research policy interface, it did strike me that there are some really crucial questions about our mode of working that really go to how we can make this work. And very, very interested in our American colleagues, I guess. And as I say, it seems to me the Kennedy School is an exemplar of finding modes of working that do actually produce tangible, useful outputs that are both useful for government advice and also useful for career progression for academics. I think we need to be realistic about this. We need to think about the resourcing. These things don't come for free. We need to think about the right instrument for different types of work. Already I've talked about, there are small technical pieces that strike me as relatively suitable for consultancy type arrangements. You can set the problem in a reasonably clear way. You can allow someone to just go and think about it and report back. But we use that instrument, I think, far too often, and for problems that are much, much more complex. For, as I said, in Ian's phrase, problems that require an adaptive leadership style or an adaptive problem-solving style. In those problems, we need to be talking, we need to be iterating the question, we need to be getting a sense of constraint, we need to be thinking about whether or not these proposed solutions might be viable. And I think that does require different modes of working. I make the point here that when I think about the main outputs from academic work, when I think about journal articles, it is extremely rare for a journal article to make an immediate practical impact, even on genuinely policy interested people in the public service. Extremely rare. What happens is that the epistemology of it, again, the problem structure of it, is that to make it solvable, to make it tractable, generally the problem is put in such a narrow way that when we in the public service read it, it's very, very hard for us to generalise and think about what that means in terms of a broader policy reform. So I think we need to think about different outputs, but we need to think about different outputs that work on the academic side. And that involves resourcing, that involves an understanding of what career progression looks like for particularly early career researchers. And I think we need to do better on exchanges. We need to think about doing better in walking in each other's shoes. And Kathy talked a little bit about that. Previously, I think the sense again from the US experience, that there's much more natural and structural interchange between public schools and government is really interesting. Now, I don't think there's anything remotely startling or surprising about those conclusions. It's really about how to make it happen in practice, but I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Maybe I can turn to you, Glenn, first with your experience on the research side and the government side in the United States. I think we often talk about the US model or the Kennedy School model or the Harvard model or a version of that as a point of comparison for our own experience here. And I guess I'd be keen to hear from all of you about how you think this works in the United States, how it's changed over time, and particularly how you think about your own role and the role of your institution to link research and policy?
I'm so glad you asked me.
That was about 5 questions.
On what would have been Saturday morning here in Canberra, I journeyed from my home in Brookline, Massachusetts to Logan Airport to begin my journey out here. And I feel like I shouldn't have come all this way if I don't say something provocative. So I ask your forbearance. I am a Maverick. He asked me about my own experience, so I'm using the first person. And I'm not interested in being useful to policymakers. I sit in a university. My salary is paid by people who are seeking my creative thought, my pedagogic influence on students, and my contribution to the larger public discussion about important questions. And I think my role should be critical. I think that my role should be demystifying and unmasking. I think I should stand outside the structures of power to the extent that I can be useful and offer more or less well-informed commentary, analysis, and critical observation about what's going on. And I worry that the professionalization of policy studies and the intimate connections between policy scholars and the public servants who make use of their output will somehow weaken or undermine the critical function that particularly university-based scholars ought to play. So that I offer as preface, and with your forbearance, I'd like to share with you something, just a small bit of a lecture that I gave recently that exemplifies this kind of intellectual role that I think some critics and analysts of public policy should play. So may I do that? Thank you. I did, after all, get up in Boston on Saturday morning, heading for this venue. Thank you. Thank you for your forbearance. So I was talking about punishment policy in the United States, about prisons, about jail, policing, crime and punishment. And this is what I had to say, and I'll just be 5 or 6 minutes saying it. America's prison system has grown into a leviathan unmatched in human history. Anyone professing to love liberty should be deeply troubled by this. That incarceration on a massive scale has become a central component of social policy in this country is a preeminent moral challenge to be faced, not merely a technical problem to be solved. My job, that is not simply to help them do it better, but to raise the question about whether it should be done at all and what the meaning of it is that it is being done in the way that it is done for the character of our democracy, for the consistency of the moral pronouncements that we make on the world stage, and so on. That's what I'm saying here. We're not dealing here with mere policy analysis. The very nature of the country is at stake, and our integrity is on the line. America, with great armies deployed under a figurative banner reading freedom, harbors the largest custodial infrastructure for the mass deprivation of liberty on the planet. Poorly educated Black and Latino men find their most salient interaction with the American state to be coercive. More than mere law enforcement, more than locking up bad guys in the name of public safety, incarceration has become a modality of governance. It is social policy writ large, and no nation on earth does it quite the way we do. I will skip over some stuff. What are the responsibilities of the policy intellectual in this situation? That's our question here. I think it's a difficult question, for punishing criminals is not merely instrumental state action, it is also expressive. Americans have these last decades wanted to send a message and have done so with a vengeance. Along the way, we have constructed a national narrative to assuage our fears. And we have answered the question, who is to blame for the maladies which beset our troubled civilization? We intellectuals have played a key role in this process. For instance, any cost-benefit analysis of the historic prison buildup needs to specify, at least implicitly, how one reckons the pain imposed on imprisoned people and those with whom they share social affiliation. A failure to consider collateral damage of this kind in the development of policy implicitly discounts the humanity of the thieves, drug sellers, prostitutes, rapists, and yes, of those whom we would unceremoniously put to death. Yet it is clear that choosing the weight, if any, to place on a thug's well-being or on that of his wife or his son is not a scientific question. Nor do the data tell us how to weigh any additional cost borne by the offending classes against the benefit of increased security and peace of mind for the rest of us. That is, the data can only take us so far in our quest to identify ideal institutions, not counting the cost imposed on offenders by institution of punishment, which is routine in the policy evaluation of the effectiveness of punishment in the United States. Not counting such costs is a political, not a scientific decision. We intellectuals, too many of us, wittingly or not, have become the handmaidens to a massive internal mobilization that our work has helped to justify and to implement, and somebody has to say it. This is serious business. Punishment is rooted in violence. Prison institutionalizes the necessary, though problematic, violence routinely undertaken by the state on behalf of the citizenry in the interest of order maintenance. Social control and management of the unruly are one function served by such institutions, but social affirmation, the construction of the virtuous we, is a less celebrated, though no less central function. And the violence is not only physical, there is also a violence of thought and conception, a violence of ideas, if you will. And key to this violence of ideas is the mystifying process by means of which the exercise of might on this scale and with this degree of inequality comes to seem natural, inevitable, necessary, and just. Rather than becoming cheerleaders in this process, my view is that responsible policy intellectuals must strive to demystify, which is to say, to lay bare the underlying ideological terrain. Okay, so that ends my self-quotation, and I think exemplifies my point. Somebody's got to ask the ambassador about the drones.
Thank you, Glenn. I think the point about different roles for the research community in society is a really crucial one, and I hope we come back to that. And I think also I'd like to come back to the sense you gave at the beginning of your remarks that something's changing in the weighing and the balancing of those roles more broadly. But I'd like to give Matthew and then Bruce an opportunity to talk about their work and their perspective, and then we'll open it up. Matthew, you first, perhaps?
Sure. Thanks, Glenn, for that. I think these comments will dovetail nicely on those. So this week we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Gideon, which gave gave folks in the criminal justice system a right to a lawyer, a right to an attorney. And in the United States, that right is extended only to folks that are caught up in criminal cases. It's not extended to those caught up in civil cases, which make up the vast bulk of the criminal justice system. So this is questions of eviction. These are questions of getting your children taken away and the erasure of parental rights. And so there's been a movement afoot to have a civil Gideon, to provide folks with lawyers in civil cases. The effects of civil Gideon are mixed, according to policy research. There's not a lot done with it, but there's some. The effects are mixed. So what's that mean? One worry I have, one concern I have, is the scientific imperative or the scientific authority de-seating all other kinds of authority, including a kind of moral authority or a critical authority, where it's just the right thing to provide someone with a lawyer if what's at stake is their housing, or what's at stake is a permanent erasure of parental rights. And I think that we need to have a conversation about how that's going to be done. I want to make a quick point too on innovation, and I think that with many of the problems that were raised today by the ambassador, food, cyber, innovation is absolutely central and really important. But in many other problems, the kinds that we've been discussing over the last 2 days, poverty, inequality, innovation can be kind of overrated. And sometimes I feel that we treat enduring social problems like we treat medical problems. Like if we just had a vaccine, if we could just find it and find the pill. And often this manifests itself in things like we look at problems. It's like we fed a child half what the child needed, and then the child didn't grow, and we go back and say, oh my goodness, we need to have different kind of food. I need to find a different innovation for this. Whereas the kid just needs to eat more. Or sometimes it's the case where we feed a child for a year and then expect him to grow 4 feet tall. We expect amazing returns in housing, which is what I've been studying for the last several years. We're asking all these questions about housing vouchers. Do housing vouchers increase incomes? Who cares? Oftentimes when families get a housing voucher, it's like, thank you, Jesus. It's like amazing, this amazing lift, and it doesn't have to solve every kind of problem. And so often the problem isn't, and it also, when we kind of reach after innovation, it often suggests that we don't know that things work, but we do. We know a lot of things, good old-fashioned things work. And so often the policy problem isn't what works or what are the effects. Often the problem is how to get it through the United States House of Representatives, or how to get it implemented. And so just a few quick thoughts on that to dovetail with Glenn's thought is about what are the role of researchers in this, besides and beyond the role of policy evaluators. So Glenn mentioned the role of the critic, the prophetic researcher, which connects social science back to its original roots, which is a branch of moral philosophy. There's also a relationship between social science and law that I think is a little underdeveloped. And so Kathy talked about Gautreaux. If you think of Brown versus Board of Education, many of think of the Affordable Care Act, which hinged on the judgment of a single Supreme Court judge. Many of our biggest policies have to go through the courts one way or another. And even if that doesn't, in Australia, even if that doesn't have a long federal impact, it can still have very powerful, I think, impact on the local or city level. So I've been doing work evaluating third-party policing, for example, which is a new kind of policing that's in Australia and all over the Anglophone world that holds landlords accountable for their tenants' behavior. And one of the findings is this has really disproportionate impact on victims of domestic violence. It's causing them to be evicted. That's illegal. And but to see that that's illegal, you need someone like me that's basically holed up in an office crunching the numbers. And so I think that, and after the findings came out, I was approached by the ACLU and other litigative groups that want to kind of roll out and try to get these policies off the books, not based on political will, not based on policy change, but based on the fact that it's most likely violations of statutory and constitutional protections. That's another role I think we can play. A second is about responding to a crisis. So in the U.S. right now, we're having a real conversation about guns, and I think we're having a real conversation about guns because we had a tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut, and because the university and the media were prepared for it, were ready for it. And so right after Newtown, the message was kind of unequivocal. It's about guns. Let's start having this conversation. And I think that thinking about changing the message could be thinking about, okay, if things happen one way or another, if we experience a crisis, like the global financial crisis, like the housing crisis, like tragedies in Newtown, what can we do to kind of to strike while the iron's hot, so to speak? Just two more very quick things is showing alternatives. I think we can show alternatives. I think often we get used to social arrangements like when I talk to my financial advisor about what I should save for college, she responds by saying like $500,000. We don't have to get used to that, and I think that a role of the researchers suggests that that's kind of new, and with the housing situation too, that's kind of new. So Bourdieu used to say history is the best solvent for doxa, and I think that just showing different alternatives and how they've worked in the past, I think could be extremely productive for the policy discussion. And the last thing I'd like to mention is just showing the people, and I think food stamps is a direct result of Bobby Kennedy and a documentary film crew going down to southern Mississippi and showing malnourished kids and sparking this public conversation. Or think of the impact that someone like Jacob Rees had on the housing quality by just taking photographs of degrading tenements in New York City. So I think I'm with Glenn. There's the role of the researcher with respect to the policy question is much larger than often we assume.
There are some really important issues there that we might come back to and questions about evaluation of policy and the role of researchers in that. And I think both Subho and Matt have sort of raised this issue of being ready when an issue comes, and the ambassador talked about that as well, and maybe how the research community does and can anticipate issues and be ready to contribute when a crisis happens. But Bruce, maybe to you and then to the floor.
Yeah, I'll be very brief, and I'll make just 2 points. I think there's a great discussion. I very much appreciate everyone's remarks. So I think one thing in which there seems to be broad agreement on in the panel, I believe, is that researchers might contribute more broadly to policy than is usually thought, and they contribute in a way that speaks to the definition of policy questions, right? Instead of just taking the policy question as exogenously given by the elected official, and then the researcher goes out and collects data and so on to try and answer the question, the researcher can make a positive contribution to the policy questions that are asked. So we're not placed in the position of doing good research on bad policy. That's Glenn's concern, right? But we can become involved in trying to formulate good policy in a more fundamental way. How might we do this? I think some of this work looks different from the kind of research we academics do in our offices. I think sometimes it can involve creating a space for conversations and becoming involved in conversations that are fairly open-ended between policy practitioners and researchers. A model for this might be the Kennedy School executive session, where you have a sustained set of meetings over a period of 3 years, say with 30 people, 25 leading practitioners and policy makers, ideally people with juice in the system, who can make decisions, and they're engaged in a conversation with researchers in a sustained way. And part of what this does, I think, is that it can help galvanise a professional identity around a certain way of looking at problems and so on, as well as simply yielding evidence that can help decide policy questions. So that's the first point I'd make, that we need spaces for conversations between researchers and policymakers and practitioners. The second point I wanted to make, I want to speak to experiments, and because it's come up in different ways over the last 2 days, and it's very well-designed randomised trials has become something of a gold standard for how researchers can contribute to the policy process in the United States. And I think it's unfortunate. I think it's a mistake. Experiments can yield evidence for very sharply posed questions. And the outcomes that the experiment is measuring often becomes the decisive criterion by which a policy is judged. And so the experiment moves us away, I think, from this more open-ended conversation between researchers and practitioners. And the experimental outcome often becomes the dominant criteria by which policy is judged. That experimental outcome legitimizes a certain way of measuring the value of the value of a policy. The case I'm thinking about is programs to reduce criminal offending for people who are coming out of prison. All of those programs are measured in terms of their effects on recidivism. Many don't work, and the ones that do work often have really little effect. So literacy programs, for example, which are widely used and widely recommended. The experimental evidence for the effects of literacy on reducing recidivism among ex-offenders is not very good. Does that mean we should not do those programs? I don't think so, right? I mean, sometimes teaching people to read is a value in itself, and something we should value for reasons other than recidivism reduction. Sometimes teaching people to read is a dignified way of treating a person, and that's a reason to justify the policy. But if we focus only on recidivism, these sorts of other criteria drop off the agenda. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Bruce. I think right across the different perspectives on the panel, there's this sense that the importance of asking the right kinds of questions and who gets to be involved in that process of asking questions and framing questions. And for me, the really interesting thing with these different models and these different roles is how do we learn from that, and how do we kind of talk to each other and teach people about what kind of model is going to work in different roles. And I think that's a really interesting challenge. I'm not sure we've still kind of worked our way through. But what I'd like to do, because we're running out of time, is open it up to the floor. Microphones are here, and put your hand up if you want to ask a panel a question. Got one over there.
I want to make a comment just before my question. I often want to do trials and try some stuff out, but Fred Chaney once clipped me under the ear and said, "Bonita, you have more pilots than Qantas." So there's a hesitancy there. I'd like to ask the panel more generally the question I asked the ambassador, and I want to ask them that because I felt that the response to my question was really quite surprising in that his response to how do we get people more involved and have the public influence, both researchers and the policy considerers and decision makers, how do we have those values really positively influence on those issues? His response was put more compliance and more scrutiny and more, I think he even used the word real penalties for people who move away from it. And I guess I was looking for something different. I'm really looking to ask, how do we make sure that those good values of people, just like you highlighted, Matthew, when we shine the spotlight on a problem and society sees it as a whole, they'll say, that's appalling, those children shouldn't starve. And politicians then pay attention to the people who vote for them. How do we have that strengthened? What mechanisms can we put in place so that researchers and policy decision makers are influenced more heavily by those good values of people in our society?
Anyone?
It's a really great question, and it's a difficult question, and I think that it's one that I think we're much more comfortable talking about what might be called a technocratic democracy, where you have academics, policymakers, physicists, folks in the room that kind of are, all have the basic skill sets, and then we figure it out. But what's it mean to expand that we beyond? What's it mean to participate in something that's broader than this kind of technocratic democracy when you're dealing with confronting problems of enormous complexity, like financial regulation? And I don't think that's a question that we've really grappled with a lot. And I think a great example is the university's role in the Occupy movement. And so I think if you compare the university's participation in the Occupy movement with the university's participation in the civil rights movement, I think you see a lot less participation in Occupy. And that doesn't mean it didn't happen, and doesn't mean that we didn't host teach-ins and things like that, but I don't think we were quite prepared for it, I suppose.
We'll have a next one here, but I think to pick up on your point too, Matthew, about sort of scientisation as well, and the different kinds of authority and the roles they play in some of these debates. I think one of the things when we're working here in partnership with the public service, we're linking up researchers and people in departments in government, but there is, I detect sometimes a sort of a reluctance to engage with the politics as well as the policy, and I think I wonder about the role of the research community in that more broadly, and whether that's a direct engagement or a more indirect form.
Yes.
Question here?
I agree with Glenn that research has to be independent and that the hard questions have to be asked and the hard or unpleasant answers have to be presented. However, I think the responsibility of a researcher is also to then sell the value of that result. And I think climate change, for instance, is a very good example of how persuasion or selling of an idea has completely failed at all levels, from the researchers to the public, to the voters, by politicians, by researchers, by everybody. So I think there really is a step after the research, that the research really has to be sold, and by that I mean that somebody has to be persuaded that a good idea should be implemented.
And that act of persuasion may be undermined to the extent that the strident researcher makes clear his or her own ideological or political commitments and causes the recipient of the research to then be guarded about whether the motive is objective reporting of the study or some agenda that the climate scientist or the student of social policy in the US hasn't made explicit.
Well, I guess it's more difficult with social sciences, but one would think that in hard science, and a result is a result. That doesn't mean it's 100% right and that it's not going to be overturned in years to come.
Right.
And in that sense, it's no more certain than attitudes in social research. But I think the persuasion, and I guess that's what publications are for, or forums like this, that an idea is actually made palatable to the voters. So the politician isn't worried that they're going to be thrown out of office if they implement something that is unpopular.
Can I start just by offering a quick comment on the climate change point? I actually think that a really important feature of talking about climate change science in the public debate has been precisely that mixing, if you like, of sociological or epistemological factors and thinking about science and scientific results and the physics of it as shorthand. And I think that part of what's actually been very problematic for the science community has been a realisation of a certain degree of vulnerability on those broader social constructivist aspects of their practice. And I said in my talk, I'm by background a physics grad student, and so I have a very strongly held view that the science is the science and that it's based on a reading of the evidence and that peer review matters, all of the things that you would expect me to think. But in my physics education, in my physics training, I had almost no grounding in the ethics of science. I had no grounding in the history and philosophy of science, and I had very little reflection on the scientific method. What is the basis for thinking that a truth claim from a natural scientist has a privileged view in the public debate? Now, in climate change science, where people are really struggling is this idea that people just get up and say what they think, and they think that's as valid as someone that's studied it their whole life. Now, why are we stuck about that? We're stuck because the first recourse for a lot of climate scientists is to say, but I'm objective. I stand apart, I'm independent. Whereas actually what is going on is that their truth claims are tested through a broader social process that we have a great deal of confidence in through the scientific method. But this sense of trying to think about how knowledge structures are put together is really quite alien for people from a very traditional physics background like myself. And so now a large part of my work is thinking about communicating climate change science. And so we're grappling with exactly those questions. And I think it's really, really interesting space. If I could just go back to the previous question, which was about how do you talk about values and the ethical basis or the moral basis of policy in the public debate, it does seem to me there's a crucial role for universities in that broader civic conversation. Of course, I'm very sympathetic to exactly what Glenn was saying. I think that goes to broader questions of the role of universities in public life and the role of academics in public life. And so I think that's a really interesting and important conversation to have as well. But I guess my introductory remarks were more framed around in interactions where academics have decided to be involved in providing research advice or something that is an input explicitly to public policy formulation, then I think that takes into a different frame and that puts a different responsibility on you to think about how this might actually work in practice. How do you get these things done? Yeah.
I'm conscious of the time, but maybe we could have one more before lunch. Yeah, thanks.
This on? Yeah. This is Jen Pei from DUA. We do some evaluation on the pilot programs, place-based programs. Is any of the panel members have experience how to evaluate these place-based programs? What's the main challenges, especially from USA perspectives?
Anyone can comment on evaluation?
Main challenges. So, So I've conducted some place-based evaluations and in the criminal justice field, and I think they're complicated evaluations, I think, because local contexts are often complex bundles of a whole variety of social and economic conditions, and if you're looking at how outcomes vary across sites, or how policy effects vary across sites, it's often very unclear why that's so. There's many rival explanations for why that's so. So the challenges of causal inference are really acute in those settings. And I think it's often useful to cast your net widely and think of a whole variety of experimental outcomes that might be interesting, and see if there's a pattern of effects that makes substantive sense across outcomes. And I think it can be useful to be open to learning from such evaluations. It can be useful to take non-causal lessons from such evaluations, and understanding the structure of correlations across sites. So, in my setting, if we're interested in social and economic disadvantage of people, and there are all these different dimensions of it, then the structure of correlations across sites may be intrinsically, substantively interesting, even though it may not be very informative about policy effects. That's what I would offer. And I think in general, right, we want to be open to learning from social scientific evidence in a way that's broader than the simple evaluation of policy effects.
All right. Thank you for your patience and sticking with us. Please join me in thanking our panel members for this session.